The rain was a relentless fist against the corrugated iron roof of the shack. Each thud, each shiver of the metal, resonated deep within Elias's skull, a constant, throbbing reminder of his isolation. He'd been tracking the stag for 3 days, lured deeper and deeper into the Blackwood, a forest even the oldest locals whispered about with a tremor in their voices. Now, holed up in this dilapidated hunter's cabin, with night clawing at the windows and the storm howling like a banshee, he questioned his sanity. The Blackwood was a place of perpetual twilight. Even at midday, sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, leaving the forest floor shrouded in a gloom that seemed to cling to the skin. The trees themselves were ancient, their gnarled branches twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled skeletal arms reaching out to ensnare the unwary. Their bark was slick with moss, a vibrant, unsettling green that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. Elias had ignored the warnings, of course. He was a seasoned hunter, a man who prided himself on his skill and his fearlessness. The stag, a magnificent beast with a rack of antlers that resembled a crown of thorns, had become an obsession. He'd seen it only fleetingly, a ghost moving through the shadows, but the sheer size and power of the animal had ignited a primal instinct within him. He had to have it. Now, huddled beside the dying embers of the fire, the thrill of the hunt had curdled into a gnawing fear. The shack was barely more than a shell, its walls riddled with holes that whistled with the wind. The single window was cracked and filthy, offering a distorted view of the swirling darkness outside. He'd found some damp firewood stacked in a corner, enough to keep a small fire going, but the dampness made it hiss and sputter, releasing acrid smoke that stung his eyes. He pulled his threadbare wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ward off the creeping chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the shack. He hadn't eaten since morning, his stomach gnawing with hunger, but the thought of venturing out into the storm to retrieve his pack was unbearable. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the image of the stag, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick coat, its breath misting in the cold air. But instead, his mind filled with images of gnarled trees, whispering branches, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. He had been tracking the stag along a narrow, overgrown trail when he first noticed the feeling. It was subtle at first, a prickling on the back of his neck, a sense of unease that he initially dismissed as fatigue. But as he ventured deeper into the Blackwood, the feeling intensified, growing into a palpable sense of dread. He could almost feel eyes on him, watching him from the shadows, following his every move. He tried to rationalize it. The Blackwood was known for its wildlife, wolves, bears, wildcats. He was simply on edge, his senses heightened by the hunt. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step, until it became a suffocating weight on his chest. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A glimpse of something pale and indistinct moving between the trees. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. He scanned the trees, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom, but saw nothing. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched remained, sharper and more intense than ever. He found a shack shortly after that, a dilapidated structure that offered a small measure of shelter from the encroaching darkness. He'd hoped that the enclosed space would offer some respite from the oppressive feeling, but it only seemed to amplify it. The shadows inside the shack seemed to writhe and twist, taking on shapes that danced at the periphery of his vision. Now, as the storm raged outside, Elias was consumed by a primal fear that he had never experienced before. It wasn't the fear of the wild, the fear of being lost or injured. It was something deeper, something more profound, a fear that spoke to the very core of his being. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the shack, searching for the source of his unease. The only light came from the flickering fire, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the sound of rustling leaves and the creaking of branches. He thought he heard something else too. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. He strained his ears, trying to isolate the sound, but it was swallowed by the storm. He dismissed it as his imagination, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He reached for his rifle, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal. He needed to feel it in his hands, the weight of it a tangible reassurance in the face of the encroaching darkness. He checked the chamber, his movements clumsy with fear. He had only a handful of rounds left. He'd been counting on bagging the stag early on, and hadn't prepared for a drawn-out chase. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the shack, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Elias jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He swung the rifle towards the door, his finger tightening on the trigger. He held his breath, listening intently, but all he could hear was the howling wind and the relentless rain. He slowly lowered the rifle, his hand trembling. It was probably just a branch falling on the roof, he told himself. The shack was old and dilapidated, and the storm was fierce. But the feeling of dread remained, clinging to him like a shroud. He huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the sounds of the storm. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the darkness, but the images of gnarled trees and whispering branches persisted. He could feel the eyes on him, watching him, waiting. He drifted in and out of sleep, plagued by nightmares. He dreamt of the stag, its antlers dripping with blood, its eyes burning with an unholy light. He dreamt of pale figures moving through the trees, their faces obscured by shadows, their hands reaching out to him. He awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire had dwindled to embers, leaving the shack shrouded in darkness. The storm had subsided slightly, but the wind still howled through the cracks in the walls. He lay there for a moment, listening intently, but all he could hear was the wind and the rain. He slowly reached for his rifle, his hand trembling. He needed to get out of there. He couldn't stay in the shack any longer. He was certain that something was watching him, something evil. He rose to his feet, his muscles stiff and sore. He stumbled towards the door, his hand reaching for the latch. He hesitated for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a premonition of something terrible about to happen. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and threw open the door. The world outside was a swirling mass of gray. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind still howled, whipping through the trees. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Elias stepped out of the shack, his rifle held at the ready. He scanned the trees, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. He saw nothing. He took a tentative step forward, then another. He moved slowly, cautiously, his senses on high alert. He felt the eyes on him, watching him, waiting. He followed the trail back towards the direction he'd come, each step filled with trepidation. The trees seemed to press in on him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The shadows danced and writhed, taking on shapes that resembled grotesque figures. He heard a rustling in the bushes ahead of him. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. He waited, his breath held tight in his lungs. A small deer darted out of the bushes, its eyes wide with fear. Elias lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. He let out a shaky breath. It was just a deer. He continued down the trail, his pace quickening. He wanted to get out of the Blackwood as quickly as possible. He never wanted to see this place again. The trail led him deeper into the forest, winding through a labyrinth of trees and undergrowth. He felt lost, disoriented. He couldn't remember which way he'd come. He stopped, his head swimming. He was completely lost. He closed his eyes, trying to regain his bearings. He could feel the eyes on him, watching him, mocking him. He opened his eyes and looked around him, his gaze darting from tree to tree. He thought he saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, his rifle raised, but saw nothing. He was starting to lose his mind. He was imagining things. He needed to get a grip on himself. He took a deep breath and started walking again, pushing his way through the dense undergrowth. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to keep moving. He couldn't stay in one place. He came to a clearing, a small, open space in the middle of the forest. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its branches reaching up towards the sky like gnarled fingers. Elias stopped, his eyes drawn to the tree. It was the largest tree he had ever seen, its trunk so wide that it would take several men to encircle it. The tree exuded an aura of ancient power, a sense of age and wisdom that seemed to emanate from its very core. He felt drawn to the tree, compelled to approach it. He didn't know why, but he couldn't resist the urge. He started walking towards it, his feet moving as if of their own accord. As he approached the tree, he noticed something strange about its trunk. It was covered in carvings, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. He reached out and touched the bark, his fingers tracing the outlines of the carvings. The carvings depicted strange symbols, figures that resembled animals and humans, but were somehow distorted and grotesque. He felt a sense of unease as he studied the carvings, a feeling that he was looking at something ancient and forbidden. He noticed something else too. A small opening at the base of the tree, a dark, narrow hole that seemed to lead into the trunk. He peered into the hole, but could see nothing. It was too dark. He felt an overwhelming urge to climb inside the tree, to explore the darkness within. He didn't know why, but he couldn't resist the urge. He knelt down and peered into the hole once more. As he looked into the hole, he thought he saw something move in the darkness. A flicker of movement, a glint of light. He strained his eyes, trying to see what it was. Then he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing with an unholy light, staring back at him from the darkness. He gasped and recoiled, his heart leaping into his throat. He stumbled backwards, away from the tree, his rifle raised. He stared at the hole, his eyes wide with terror. He knew that something was in there, something evil. The eyes continued to stare at him, their unholy light burning into his soul. He could feel their gaze, piercing him, probing him, searching him. Then, the eyes moved. They started to drift towards him, slowly, steadily, until they were just inches from his face. He could see them clearly now, burning with an infernal fire, filled with a malevolent intelligence. He screamed and fired his rifle, the sound echoing through the forest. The bullets ripped through the air, slamming into the tree trunk around the hole. The eyes flickered for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. Elias stood there, frozen with terror, his rifle still raised. He waited for something to happen, but nothing did. He slowly lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. He had just shot at something in the tree, something that had stared at him with glowing eyes. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He turned and ran, sprinting away from the tree as fast as he could. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. He ran blindly, stumbling through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran until he could run no more, until his lungs burned and his legs ached. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He lay there for a long time, trying to catch his breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He couldn't shake the image of those eyes, burning with their unholy light. He knew that he would never forget them. He eventually managed to gather his strength and get to his feet. He looked around him, trying to get his bearings. He was still deep in the forest, surrounded by trees. He had no idea which way to go. He was completely lost. He started walking again, choosing a direction at random. He walked for hours, his legs aching, his body exhausted. He saw no signs of civilization, no trails, no roads. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the forest floor. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the trees. Elias felt a sense of despair washing over him. He was lost, alone, and it was getting dark. He knew that he couldn't survive another night in the Blackwood. He stumbled upon a small stream, its water cold and clear. He knelt down and drank deeply, quenching his thirst. He splashed some water on his face, trying to revive himself. As he looked up from the stream, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing on the opposite bank of the stream was the stag. The magnificent beast with the crown of thorns antlers. It stood there, perfectly still, its eyes fixed on Elias. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching him. Elias stared back at the stag, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had been tracking this animal for days, and now it was standing right in front of him. He slowly reached for his rifle, his hand trembling. He had one bullet left. He knew that he had to take the shot. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, his finger tightening on the trigger. He aimed carefully, focusing on the stag's chest. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, the sound echoing through the forest. The bullet flew through the air, striking the stag in the chest. The stag didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice that it had been shot. It continued to stand there, its eyes fixed on Elias. Then, slowly, deliberately, the stag began to smile. A horrifying, unnatural smile that stretched its lips back, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Elias screamed and dropped his rifle, his legs turning to jelly. He stumbled backwards, away from the stag, his mind reeling with terror. The stag took a step forward, then another. It crossed the stream, its hooves splashing in the water. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving Elias. Elias turned and ran, sprinting away from the stag as fast as he could. He ran blindly, stumbling through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the stag behind him, its hooves pounding on the ground, its breath hot on his neck. He knew that it was gaining on him. He tripped and fell, landing hard on the ground. He scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The stag was upon him. It lowered its head and charged, its antlers aimed directly at Elias's chest. Elias screamed and closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. But the impact never came. He opened his eyes and looked up. The stag was standing right in front of him, its antlers just inches from his face. It didn't touch him. It simply stood there, its eyes fixed on him, its horrifying smile stretched across its face. Then, it spoke. Its voice was deep and guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. Elias tried to speak, but no words would come out. He was paralyzed with fear. The stag lowered its head and nudged Elias with its antlers. He stumbled backwards, his legs giving way beneath him. He fell to the ground, his eyes fixed on the stag. The stag took a step closer, its eyes burning into his soul. "This is my domain," it said. "And you are not welcome here." Then, it lowered its head and devoured him. Elias woke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He was lying in his bed, in his own home. The sun was shining through the window, birds were singing outside. It was a beautiful morning. He sat up in bed, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been in the Blackwood, he had tracked the stag, he had been attacked by it. But it had all been a dream. A terrible, vivid dream. He got out of bed and went to the bathroom, splashing some water on his face. He looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He still felt the fear, the terror, the sense of dread that had consumed him in the dream. He knew that he would never forget it. He went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. He sat down at the table and stared out the window, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He told himself that it was just a dream, nothing more. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something more than that. It had felt so real, so vivid, so terrifying. He finished his coffee and went to the living room. He picked up the newspaper and started to read, trying to distract himself. But he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept wandering back to the dream, to the Blackwood, to the stag. He threw the newspaper down in frustration and got up. He decided to go for a walk, to get some fresh air. He went outside and started walking down the street, his mind still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked around him, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. People were going about their daily lives, walking their dogs, chatting with their neighbors. He continued walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But it persisted, growing stronger with each step. He came to a small park, a green oasis in the middle of the city. He decided to go inside and sit on a bench, to relax for a few minutes. He sat down on a bench under a large oak tree, its branches providing shade from the sun. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. He heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. He opened his eyes and looked around. He saw a small deer, its eyes wide with fear, staring at him from the bushes. He stared back at the deer, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a surge of terror, a primal fear that threatened to overwhelm him. The deer stepped out of the bushes and began to walk towards him, its eyes never leaving his. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from the deer. But he was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The deer stopped right in front of him, its eyes burning into his soul. Then, slowly, deliberately, the deer began to smile. A horrifying, unnatural smile that stretched its lips back, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Elias screamed, a long, piercing shriek that echoed through the park. People turned to look at him, their faces filled with concern. They saw a man sitting on a bench, screaming at a deer. They thought he was crazy. But Elias knew better. He knew that the deer was not just a deer. It was something else. Something evil. Something that had followed him out of the Blackwood. Something that would never let him go. He looked closer. The deer's left ear was tattered, a small chunk missing, a wound he remembered inflicting on the stag during the hunt, to mark it. To claim it. To bind it to him. He felt a cold dread creep through him. He hadn't escaped the Blackwood. He'd brought it with him. The smile widened on the deer's face, and Elias knew he was damned. Not just for entering the Blackwood, but for trying to conquer it. For believing he could take something that wasn't his. The rain started again, a soft drizzle at first, then a downpour. The people in the park scattered, seeking shelter. Elias remained on the bench, staring at the deer, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, tears mixing with the water streaming down his face. He closed his eyes. He could hear the whispering of the trees, the creaking of the branches, the howling of the wind. He was back in the Blackwood. He opened his eyes. He was still in the park. But he was no longer alone. The deer was gone. But in its place, standing before him, was a figure cloaked in shadows, its face obscured by a hooded cowl. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him forward. Elias knew that he had no choice. He had to follow. He rose from the bench and started walking towards the figure, his feet moving as if of their own accord. He left the park and walked down the street, the figure leading the way. He walked for hours, his legs aching, his body exhausted. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew that he couldn't stop. He came to a familiar place, a place he knew well. It was his own home. He stopped in front of his house, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to go inside. He knew that something terrible was waiting for him there. The figure turned to him, its face still obscured by the cowl. It raised its hand again, beckoning him to enter. Elias hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and opened the door. He stepped inside his house, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was as he had left it. But something was different. Something was wrong. He could feel it, a sense of unease, a sense of dread that permeated the air. The figure followed him inside, its presence filling the room. Elias turned to face the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was about to face his final reckoning. The figure slowly reached up and pulled back its cowl, revealing its face. Elias gasped. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The face was his own. But it was not the face he knew. It was twisted and distorted, its eyes burning with an unholy light, its lips stretched back in a horrifying smile. "Welcome home," the figure said, its voice a deep and guttural rasp. Elias stared at his doppelganger, his mind reeling. He didn't understand. What was happening? The figure took a step closer, its eyes burning into his soul. "You thought you could escape the Blackwood," it said. "But you were wrong. The Blackwood never lets go." Then, it lunged at him, its hands reaching for his throat. Elias screamed, but no one heard him. He was alone. And he was about to die. He thrashed, he fought, he clawed, but it was no use. His doppelganger was too strong, too relentless. The figure's grip tightened on his throat, cutting off his air. His vision began to blur, his lungs burned. He felt his life slipping away, his consciousness fading into darkness. As he drew his last breath, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing behind his doppelganger, watching him die, was the stag. Its antlers dripping with blood, its eyes burning with an unholy light, its horrifying smile stretched across its face. And then, everything went black. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the roof of the house. Inside, the silence was broken only by the faint sound of dripping water. The house stood empty, its windows dark, its secrets buried deep within its walls. The Blackwood had claimed another victim. And it would continue to claim more, as long as there were those who dared to venture into its shadows.